It's now my pleasure to welcome Michael Strain to the show. Michael is the Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author and editor of multiple books, and his latest is The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. Thanks for being with us, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, first, can you tell us a little bit about the book, The American Dream is Not Dead, and why you thought it was so important to write?
I can, yes. The book confronts a bipartisan narrative that things are really quite dismal for typical workers and for typical households. This narrative is substantiated by claims that wages have been stagnant for decades, that households haven't seen an improvement in their living standards for decades. There's a great deal of nostalgia on both the political left and the political right for life decades ago, the argument that life was somehow better in a more holistic sense decades ago. There's an argument that the United States is no longer characterized by upward economic mobility, and that the circumstances of your birth determine the circumstances of your life. Populism plays a big role here. The populist narrative that all the gains from economic growth go to the quote unquote elites. The populist narrative that because the elites have rigged the system against typical workers and typical households, that hard work doesn't pay off and that you can't really get ahead. These are arguments that are made again on both the left and the right, and I think that they're really all wrong, and they're at odds with the data. They're morally wrong and politically wrong, I think, but perhaps more fundamentally, they're just empirically wrong. And I was concerned that this narrative was growing, and that you were hearing it from not just politicians, but you were hearing it from business leaders, you were hearing it from public intellectuals, you were hearing it from media commentators, you were hearing it from economists, and I was concerned enough to write a book about it, where I really try to lay out the kind of most plain, hands above the table, empirical arguments as to why the empirical foundations of that narrative are incorrect.
Well, great. Well, let's talk about the some of that data then. So, like you said, some of the economists, pundits, politicians have looked at the economic data of the past, and it's always slightly different. Sometimes it's the past 30 years, sometimes it's the past 50 years, sometimes it's the past 70 years that people like to look at, but claiming that there is less mobility and fewer gains to blue collar households over any of those spans of time. What's wrong with the way they're looking at the data?
Well, there are a lot of different ways to look at the data, and the kind of particular errors, I think, vary depending on what you're talking about. I think it also depends on which group you're talking about. So, politicians often say things where there's just no real empirical support for their claim. That's typically not true of economists, and so with economists, there are debates about how do you control for price changes over a 30 or 50-year period, what's the right period to look at, et cetera, et cetera. But I think kind of specifically with wage stagnation, I think the biggest mistake that people make is not separately considering the 1970s and 80s from the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s. if you look at the 70s and 80s, it is the case that wages were stagnant or even declining during that period. And that had a lot to do with the really troublingly high inflation that the US economy experienced during much of that time. Wages were growing, nominal wages were growing, but the purchasing power of those wages was overcome by prices that were growing even more rapidly than wages. And so, if you are, and a lot of people who participate in these debates have been participating in them for a long time. And so, if you're standing in the year 1992 and it's a presidential election year, and this is it's the economy stupid campaign, and you're talking about how typical workers have been left behind and how wages have been stagnant for the past 2 decades, that was correct. That's a correct interpretation of the data. But since 1990, we have seen substantial uh, growth in inflation-adjusted wages for non-supervisory workers. And this hasn't been a period of uninterrupted progress. There have been multi-year periods where wages were still stagnant since 1990. But if you kind of zoom out and look at that broad sweep, what you see is a period of pretty considerable wage growth. Wages have grown by over a third since 1990. And so in 1990, the wage stagnation argument was correct. Maybe in 1995 it was correct. Maybe in 2000, you say, okay, well, the 90s were a good period, but over the last 3 decades, it's been really bad. But at this point now, we've had over 30 years since 1990, and we know why, or we know to a large extent why the trend in real wage growth changed. It's because the Fed got inflation under control, and the recession that was required to get inflation under control ended during the 1980s. And it's just, I think, an analytical error to conflate those two regimes, the regime of the 70s and 80s from the regime that followed.
Well, that's very interesting. And the mention of, say, the 1992 election campaign, because for a long time in American politics, we assumed that Democrats and people on the left were in favor of more economic intervention in general, and Republicans and people on the right were generally in favor of less economic intervention in general. And that a lot of people have written how that has there's been a certain unraveling of populist politics since Trump started campaigning in the 2016 presidential campaign. And so some of this traditional sort of fusionism, where the traditionalist conservatives and the libertarians were both sort of allied in favor of smaller government, has unraveled a little bit. But there have been previous eras where there's been a certain amount of unraveling too, like Ross Perot's third-party candidacy in 1992, and then Pat Buchanan 4 years later in 1996 with again of the Reform Party banner. There was certainly some pro big government populism that got support from conservatives even back then, right?
Oh yeah, I mean it's kind of amazing to go back and look at Pat Buchanan's campaign in particular. It is very similar to President Trump's successful White House bid in many ways, and the rhetoric that was used, in the kind of aesthetic tone of the campaign, and in a lot of the policies also, and a lot of the policy prescriptions.
And one thing that's interesting about, again, sort of the tone, or even the aesthetics, you could say, about some of these populist critiques. One issue I hear from our friends in the conservative movement is not that there aren't enough jobs in America, but that there aren't enough of the right jobs. And often that means something very specific, like industrial and manufacturing jobs that able-bodied young men without college educations can step into out of high school. And Senator Marco Rubio, who's talked a lot about economic populist themes, he's talked and written about how, expecting young men from blue collar backgrounds to, quote, learn to code, right, to write computer code is some sort of, dismissive insult. Um, but I'm not sure I understand why. I mean, is there a reason why a coal miner's grandson shouldn't become a software engineer? Certainly safer and more highly paid.
Yeah, there's a there's this really powerful uh nostalgic dimension to a lot of populism. Um the 1950s, I think, weren't very very good to African Americans. They weren't very good to women. And so this idea that things were so great, if we could only roll back the clock to 1950, that workers would be so much better. I think at best applies to white men, but I don't even think it applies to white men. I mean, coal mining was a horrible job in many respects. Extremely hazardous, bad for your health, physically taxing and exhausting. Uh, and uh I I I think that one potential argument that would not argue for rolling back the clock, but that might argue that the kind of structure of the economy was somehow more egalitarian, uh, is the concern that the share of all jobs that are kind of middle wage jobs that can support a middle income uh, 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 household have been declining, and that has been true. So if you look at every job in the economy, the share that are kind of pay middle wages has been going down since the 1980s. But one of the things that I show in the book is that that trend has started to reverse itself, and that you're actually seeing growth in middle wage jobs. But they are different than the middle wage jobs that existed in the 1950s. They're different in some important respects. But I think that we, rather than uh, indulging in a fantasy, which is that we can roll back the clock 70 years, even if we would want to do that, which I wouldn't, but even if you would want to do that, we're not going to. What we should be doing, what leaders should be doing, is encouraging people to develop the skills uh, to take advantage of the middle class jobs that exist today, of which there are many. And I think something that gets lost a lot in this conversation is any notion of personal responsibility. People have a responsibility to earn a living. People have a responsibility to provide for themselves. People have a responsibility to provide for their families. People have a responsibility to contribute to their communities and to contribute to society. And one of the most damaging aspects of populism, I think, is that it ignores those responsibilities that we all have, and it denies people agency. It tells people that they are somehow disempowered to earn a good living, disempowered to experience upward economic mobility. And the discussion around middle class jobs, I think, really highlights this. And I think the better message from leaders is, hey, there are jobs out there. You don't need to go to college in order to earn a good salary. There are job opportunities for you. They may be different than the jobs that your father or grandfather did, but you can succeed, and you can earn a good wage, and you can climb the economic ladder. And here's how you should do it. And we're going to have public policy to help you do it. that I think is would be a much more productive direction for the conversation.
Yeah, I think about the theme of agency and personal responsibility, used to be the sine qua non of conservative view of social policy, right? When we had, the Gingrich Revolution and welfare reform in the 1990s, um, that that was the heart of that message, which sort of leads me into my next question about what one thing I find frustrating about this entire debate more from the left is uh, how some of our friends on the left look at government benefits and programs that have, increased astronomically since the 50s, certainly. Um, and they are happy to support greater social welfare spending and often recommend greater social welfare spending as a solution, but can refuse to acknowledge the effect of those transfers and the effect they've had on standard of living for people at the bottom of the income scale. How much of the current standard of living for people at the bottom, whether that's the bottom 10% or the bottom 20%, it already comes from taxpayer expenditures and benefits.
Yeah, a large chunk, and I think you know the way that I think about these is that we should be, we are a wealthy society, and in our society, we should have a safety net such that nobody falls too far. Nobody in America should be indigent. Nobody in America should go without adequate nutrition and adequate healthcare and housing and clothing. And so that's a kind of a low bar. And then the question is, but by which I mean we do a lot more than that. That we try to do, but we do a lot more than that too. And then the question is, why are we doing more than that? And I think that question has an answer, and that answer should be to encourage self-sufficiency, to encourage participation in economic life, um, and to encourage upward mobility. You can't climb the ladder till you get your foot on the first rung. Sometimes you need help getting your foot on the second rung and the third rung, but at some point, you've had enough success that your success builds on itself. And so I think we should have a safety net. I think we should have policies to increase upward mobility, but those policies should be geared toward increasing self-sufficiency, participation in economic life, and upward mobility. That's not what you hear from a lot of people on the left or the right, frankly. Um, some sort of universal income, for example, uh, is not conditioned on work. It's not motivated toward encouraging participation in economic life if there's no work requirement attached to it, if it doesn't encourage, if it's not designed to encourage work. And yet you increasingly it is it's increasingly popular to propose those kinds of policies. It's we should have a program if you're really disabled and you're not able to work. We should have a disability insurance program, but the disability insurance program we have should be geared toward helping people to work as much as they can, or in the best way they can. Somebody might be uh, disabled in a way that means that they can't, work in a retail store because they can't stand on their feet for 8 hours in a row, but maybe they could sit behind a desk and do something. And so we should, figure out how to design a disability program that encourages participation in economic life and that doesn't just give people checks. I think that we moved in that direction a lot in the 1990s. There was bipartisan support for moving in that direction. in my view, there's been some backsliding, and I think a lot of that backsliding is driven by populism, but not all of it. And that's an important uh, area of debate in social policy right now.
Yeah, the question about in particular about how to design a good, effective disability program that does not that takes care of people who are truly disabled, but does not disincentivize people who can work from work. And not everyone who's disabled is completely disabled. There's other partial disabilities, which, just like you suggested, certain jobs are not available, but certain other jobs may very well might be. Uh, it reminds me of, I believe, your colleague Nick Eberstadt, who wrote a book, Men Without Work, about the declining labor force participation rate, not unemployment rate, although we tend to just talk about the latter. And his work that suggests that Social Security, supplemental disability income, among other programs, have functioned as a perverse disincentive to young, able-bodied men who would otherwise be working, who traditionally would have been working, from being productive in the workforce. What do you think about that? Are there other programs like that you think are not only are not effective at doing what they're supposed to do, but are actually counterproductive?
I think disability insurance is an example of a counterproductive program, probably the best example of a counterproductive program. I think there are some programs that we don't often think of in this way, but that are useful to evaluate across this dimension. Two big ones are Social Security and Medicare. Those are not safety net programs. Those are social insurance programs. Disability insurance is also a social insurance program. But uh, by keeping the retirement age at 65, those programs are keeping people out of the workforce during years when a lot of people could be working. And so kind of thinking about looking at all the ways the federal government touches people's lives, and say, okay, what are the effect of these programs are having, and are these programs encouraging participation in economic life? Are they encouraging self-sufficiency and earned success? I think is a useful exercise.
Well,
Some do great. I mean, the earned income tax credit, for example, uh, is a social policy uh, that has been shown to increase participation in the workforce, and to encourage people to move from not participating into employment. It also lifts millions of people, including several million children, out of poverty each year, because it's really well targeted on low income households. And so this is a good example. This is a program that fights poverty, that pulls kids out of poverty, but that also actually increases workforce participation. So we know how to design these sorts of policies. We just need to, I think, focus more on that than we currently do.
yeah, so in addition to the policies that are directly tied to employment, some of our populist critics out there look at trade policy, free trade versus a tariff policy, as one of these big drivers of supposedly why there aren't as many manufacturing jobs as there used to be, and that sort of thing. And so critics of open trade often like to suggest that they're motivated by a sort of nationalist pride or a sense of patriotism, and that the federal government should explicitly be tilting the playing field towards U.S. firms and domestic workers. But the thing that I've always thought was a little ironic about that is the idea that they would need this favoritism in the first place, and that, in my mind, someone who's legitimately proud of U.S. firms and U.S. workers would think that they were smart and strong enough to compete on their own.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that again, I think similar to the debate about rolling back the clock 7 decades. I think that we may want the federal government to tilt the playing field toward these companies. I wouldn't. but maybe that is something that we should want. But that exceeds the government's capacity. We tried this when President Trump was president, and the best evidence suggests that President Trump's trade war actually reduced manufacturing employment. How did that happen? Well, the trade war did three things. One thing the trade war did was it protected U.S. firms from competition with foreign firms. That did lead to employment among U.S. firms going up. It also increased the cost of what are called intermediate goods. So American companies import steel and textiles and things that they need in order to make products. Those imports became more expensive. That reduced manufacturing employment. The third thing that the trade war did was it led to retaliation, because if you launch a trade war against another country, they're going to launch one back at you. And so when you look at those three effects and you add them up, what happened was a reduction in manufacturing employment, because the cost to firms of inputs being more expensive, and the cost to firms that were created by retaliation swamped any sort of benefit from being protected from import competition. Secondly, I think we forget that American firms import and export. And import competition, in some sense, leads to U.S. workers competing with foreign workers. But if you're opening up your economy, then you're also creating jobs in export-intensive sectors and in firms that export quite a bit. And so, the right economic answer to the question of what is the effect of free trade or globalization on U.S. employment is that it doesn't have an effect. That the effects of employment on import competition are roughly offset by the effects on employment of export-intensive firms and industries, and that what really matters for employment are fiscal policy and monetary policy and the kinds of programs we've been talking about. And the Fed is trying to achieve full employment at any given time, regardless of U.S. trade policy. And when you look empirically, so that's all those are all theoretical arguments, but when you look empirically, that is what you find. The kind of famous China trade shock paper only looked at half of that. The China trade shock paper looked at the effects of import competition on domestic U.S. employment. It didn't take into account the effects that trade with China had on export-intensive firms and in export-intensive sectors. And when you do that, you see that it's really basically a wash. And so again, I think that there's lots of room for debate in public affairs and in public policy, and reasonable people can disagree on quite a bit. But I think what's troubling about a lot of this populism, its diagnosis of the current state of American economic life, its diagnosis of the effects of free trade or globalization, is that they get the answers wrong. And I think in order to make progress, in order to make good public policy, in order to help typical workers and typical households to lead flourishing lives, we first need to get the facts right. And then comes what should be the harder part, which is debating what those facts mean and figuring out, how to formulate the best public policies given that set of facts. But we're getting the facts wrong, and if you're getting the facts wrong, then it's really hard to make progress.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of this excellent conversation. Thank you, Michael, for being with us, and thank you for advancing your bold and controversial facts first, conclusions afterwards theory.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.